If you've ever stood on the sidelines of your own life, watching the world whirl past in a blur of laughter, champagne glasses, and polite applause, you'll understand how Graham Wells felt on his sister's wedding day. The air inside the Sutherland Country Club shimmered with expectation, the kind that presses on your chest and makes you feel smaller with every perfectly timed toast. Somewhere near the bar, tucked beside a gilded mirror, Graham lingered half invisible, unnoticed by most, but missing nothing. He saw the way Grant Sutherland, the groom's father, glided across the room, shaking hands, dropping names, never once looking Graham in the eye. It was as if Graham didn't even exist. But that's the funny thing about life. The people you overlook are often the ones you'll remember longest. And the moments you wish you could skip are sometimes the very ones that define you. Graham had always preferred to stand in the shadows, letting his sister Riley sparkle. He wore a borrowed suit, quietly kept the peace, and let the Sutherlands plan a wedding fit for a magazine spread. Yet beneath the surface, there was more to Graham than anyone in that room realized, a story written in silent sacrifice, stubborn hope, and a determination that refused to be dimmed. This isn't just another story about sibling love or family drama. It's about the invisible battles people fight when no one is watching. It's about the choices that pull us apart, the loyalty that stitches us back together, and the quiet courage it takes to believe you matter, even when the world insists you don't. On the day of Riley's wedding, as the orchestra played and champagne flowed, Graham's past and future collided in ways neither he nor the Sutherlands could have predicted. What happened that evening didn't make the society pages. No headlines, no viral video, no gold-embossed invitations to the next big gala. But for Graham, for Riley, and for anyone who's ever been underestimated, it was the night everything changed. Sometimes life gives you a stage when you least expect it, and the courage to step into the light comes from the darkest corners of your own history. Before the vows were exchanged and the dance floor filled with laughter, before Graham found himself standing with a microphone in hand, there was a story, a journey that started long before anyone knew the Sutherland name. This is that story, a story about loss and grit, about invisible victories and the kind of strength that never demands applause. So settle in and let's begin at the very moment the world looked right past Graham Wells, never realizing that in a single evening, the invisible would become unforgettable. If you ever find yourself at the edge of a celebration, an outsider looking in, you might notice things the honored guests never do. That was Graham Wells at the Sutherland Country Club on a soft spring afternoon when his little sister Riley was marrying into a family he'd only seen from a distance. The venue shimmered with the kind of easy luxury that rarely touches ordinary lives. White linen tables, twinkling crystal, a band playing jazz standards in the background, and waiters gliding by with trays of hors d'oeuvres you couldn't pronounce. Everyone seemed to belong, at least on the surface. But Graham in his tailored but slightly out-of-date suit felt like a question mark at the end of someone else's sentence. He stood quietly cradling a glass of ginger ale, one of a handful of sober choices in a sea of champagne. From across the room, he watched Riley glow with that rare, effortless happiness he'd worked so hard to protect. She was radiant in lace and soft light, the center of every camera's gaze. The Sutherland family, led by Grant Sutherland himself, were playing their part as the perfect hosts, greeting guests with that practiced, almost theatrical ease that old money seems to bestow. It was an impressive show. Yet beneath it all, Graham felt the old familiar weight of being invisible, overlooked, underestimated, simply out of place. It wasn't the first time he'd been cast as an extra in his own story. But today, as the wedding day unfurled in a slow-motion blur of laughter, speeches, and champagne flutes clinking, the feeling was sharper than usual. Grant Sutherland, tall and impeccably dressed, barely nodded in Graham's direction, instead focusing his charm on business partners, city councilmen, and family friends with deep pockets. Graham had shaken his hand earlier, a brief indifferent grip, a polite, "Oh, you must be Riley's brother," before Grant moved on, eyes already searching for someone more important. Graham was used to it. He'd spent most of his life quietly picking up the pieces, never making a fuss, and never expecting to be the center of attention. He knew how to listen more than he spoke, how to slip out of a room without drawing notice. In a way, that was his superpower. He saw things other people missed and remembered details that made others feel seen, even if no one remembered his name in return. There's a certain honesty that comes from being overlooked. You see the world without filters, you notice the cracks in the marble, the nervous fidgeting behind practiced smiles. Graham saw it in the way Grant Sutherland held his glass, firm, possessive, as if every interaction was a negotiation, even at his own son's wedding. He saw it in the way the Sutherland cousins sized up the guests whispering in corners, and in the way Riley's new in-laws circled her, like she was something rare and precious, yet still just a little outside their orbit. Maybe that's why, when the time came for introductions, Graham hung back content to watch from the periphery. He drifted to the bar, made polite conversation with the band's pianist, a man named Otis, who'd played at his college graduation years ago, and swapped stories with the kitchen staff on a smoke break behind the venue. They talked about Detroit traffic, favorite barbecue joints, and the rising price of everything. It was familiar, grounding, a reminder that there's a whole world of people whose stories unfold in the margins. Real life, Graham knew, is often built in those quiet margins. It's found in the patient smile of the waitress who remembers your order, the janitor who unlocks the building every morning, the uncle who drives 3 hours just to show up. These were the people who mattered to Graham, the ones who understood that dignity didn't come from being noticed, but from showing up and doing what needed to be done. He'd spent years living this truth, and it had made him resilient in ways the Sutherlands, for all their elegance, might never understand. Yet even as Graham found comfort in these small, real connections, he couldn't help but feel the sting of invisibility when Riley was swept away by her new family. During the family portraits, he was directed to the far edge. "Let's make room for the parents," the photographer said, nudging Graham just out of frame. During the rehearsal dinner, he'd been mistaken for one of the event staff. He laughed it off, but inside it stung a little more each time. There's a loneliness in being present, but unseen, a sense that your place in someone's story is always up for negotiation. If you've ever felt like that, like your worth is measured by how loudly you announce yourself, then Graham's story will feel all too familiar. In America, there's a quiet pressure to make your accomplishments visible, to build a brand, chase followers, curate a life that looks good on Instagram. But some of the most meaningful victories happen in silence. They're found in the sacrifices you make for family, the risks you take that no one else sees, and the steady courage it takes to keep moving forward when no one is cheering you on. That day at the country club, Graham could have tried to prove himself to network, to correct every assumption, to tell everyone in the room who he really was and what he had built. But that wasn't his way. Instead, he chose to honor the journey that brought him there, years of quiet struggle, missed celebrations, nights spent working 2 jobs so Riley could have the life she deserved. He remembered the promise he made to their father before he died. "Take care of your sister. Don't let her dreams be smaller just because ours were cut short." Sometimes the most important roles in life are the ones no one else knows you're playing. Graham's reward was watching Riley laugh without worry, dance like the world was brand new, and lean into a future that finally felt safe. That was enough for now. But the world has a way of pushing us out of the margins when we least expect it. As the sun set and the first stars blinked over the manicured lawns, an attendant tapped Graham's shoulder. "They're asking for you inside," she said. Something about a speech. Graham blinked, caught off guard. He hadn't prepared anything. He hadn't planned to be seen at all. Yet, as he followed her back into the bright lights of the ballroom, he realized that maybe, just maybe, it was time for the invisible brother to step into the spotlight, if only for a moment. Because sometimes the greatest lesson isn't about staying in the background. It's about choosing the right moment to let the world see what you've been building all along. And so, as Graham walked toward the waiting crowd, heart pounding but head held high, he carried with him not just his own quiet story, but the hope that even those who go unnoticed can change the course of a day, a family, a future. That's where this journey truly begins. There are some memories you can trace with perfect clarity: a kitchen table cluttered with cereal bowls, laughter drifting through a half-open window, the smell of fresh-cut grass as Saturday cartoons blare in the background. For Graham Wells' childhood once seemed stitched together from small, gentle certainties: a mother humming as she folded laundry, a father with rough hands and a soft voice, Riley toddling behind with a gap-toothed grin. They weren't wealthy, not by any measure, but what they lacked in money they made up for in warmth and routines. In that little blue house with chipped paint and creaky stairs, the world felt big and safe and theirs. But life, as Graham learned far too young, does not always keep its promises. The first break in their home came quietly, almost unnoticeably, like the slow drip of water through a hairline crack. His mother, Laura, grew distant, her gaze fixed on the horizon during dinner, her laughter becoming brittle, her hands restless with longing for something no one in the family could name. Graham remembers listening at the hallway heart tight as his parents' whispered arguments stretched deep into the night. Words like sacrifice, second chance, and not enough hung in the air, heavy as storm clouds. Then one morning she was simply gone, her favorite scarf missing from the hook, the scent of her perfume lingering in the hall, and a note on the fridge that didn't say enough. Sudden abandonment leaves a mark no one else can see. For months, Graham clung to the hope that Laura would return, that the sound of her car in the driveway would turn everything back to the way it was. But as days blurred into weeks and then months even, Riley, still too little to read the note, began to understand that their family was different now. Their father, Mark, tried his best to hold them together. He took on extra shifts at the factory, learned to braid Riley's hair, and invented new rituals to fill the hollow spaces. Friday night pizzas, bedtime stories, weekend trips to the hardware store. He never spoke ill of Laura, only told Graham and Riley that sometimes grown-ups make choices that hurt, but it didn't mean they were to blame. Yet some losses never fully heal. Mark's face grew older, the lines deeper. Graham, still a child himself, felt the silent request to grow up just a bit faster, to help with chores, to watch over Riley, to be the man of the house, before he really knew what that meant. Through it all, they made do. On birthdays, Mark baked crooked cakes from boxed mixes. At Christmas, he hung lights until his hands were raw, refusing to let their home fall dark. It was a patchwork life, messy and imperfect, but theirs. Then the world cracked a second time. One gray morning, while Graham was away at college and Riley was in her last year of high school, the phone rang with news that never belongs in any childhood. There'd been an accident. A patch of black ice on Route 14, a car spinning out, and Mark's steady, stubborn Mark gone before anyone could say goodbye. Graham remembers the silence in his dorm room, the numb disbelief. He packed his bag with shaking hands, drove hours back to the little blue house, and found Riley sitting on the porch knees, hugged to her chest, eyes swollen and red. Grief, Graham realized, is less about loud wailing and more about the quiet that settles in afterward, the missing footsteps in the hall, the mail piling up the dinners eaten in exhausted silence. The funeral was a blur of faces, casseroles, and sympathy cards. Relatives he barely knew pressed his hand and whispered, "You're the man now." He wanted to scream to protest the unfairness, but all he could do was nod and try to stand straight for Riley's sake. It's one thing to lose a parent, it's another to lose the scaffolding that holds your whole life together. With Mark gone, bills and letters Graham had never seen before started showing up in the mailbox, overdue utilities, mortgage payments, hospital fees from a surgery his father had quietly endured months earlier. The truth came in waves. Mark had been drowning in debt, doing everything possible to keep the house and give Riley a chance at her own dreams. There were loans in his name, a second mortgage, maxed out credit cards. Within weeks, the bank sent notice. The little blue house was no longer theirs. That year, Graham learned the difference between grief and survival. There were no more safety nets. With no mother to call, no extended family able or willing to step in, Graham took leave from college, cashed out the tiny savings account meant for emergencies, and rented a room in a worn-down duplex near Riley's school. It wasn't much, one bedroom, a futon for Graham in the living room, and a draft that whistled through the windows at night, but it was what they could afford. He worked wherever he could, pouring coffee at a 24-hour diner, restocking shelves at the local grocery store, tutoring neighborhood kids in algebra. Riley, always the fighter, balanced her studies with a part-time job at a florist, saving every tip she earned for college application fees. Together, they learned how to make a dollar stretch. They traded name-brand cereal for store brands, fixed the car with YouTube tutorials, and celebrated birthdays with home-baked cookies instead of cake. It wasn't fair and it wasn't easy, but in every small act of resilience, they rebuilt their own kind of family. There are so many American stories like theirs, children forced to grow up overnight, siblings holding the world together with stubborn love and secondhand hope. In towns from Michigan to Texas, there are Grahams and Rileys who carry more than their share, who learn early how easily the ground can shift. Their story is not one of unique tragedy, but of a quiet, everyday heroism that too often goes unseen. Graham sometimes thought about his old life, the promise of college, the easy laughter of his classmates, the way the world had seemed full of open doors. There was bitterness in those thoughts, and envy too, as he watched other students call home for help or plan spring breaks that now belonged to another universe. But over time, Graham discovered something else. An unshakable bond with Riley, a sense of purpose that didn't come from success or applause, but from knowing that every small sacrifice mattered. He realized, too, that broken dreams aren't always the end. They can be the beginning of something stubbornly beautiful. The greatest lesson he learned was this: loss will change you, but it doesn't get the final say. Even when your world falls apart, there is a kind of strength that only grows in the empty spaces where you are forced to plant new seeds and hope they'll grow. Graham and Riley's family looked nothing like the glossy photos in a magazine, but in their shared struggles, their patched-up traditions, and their late-night kitchen talks, they found a kind of love that couldn't be shaken loose. As months turned into years, their scars faded but never disappeared. Each milestone, a high school diploma, a new job, a letter from a college admissions office, felt doubly earned. Sometimes when Riley laughed too loudly, or when Graham managed to pay another month's rent on time, they both felt it, the ache of what had been lost, and the fierce gratitude for what remained. This is the story behind the wedding, the unseen layers beneath the lace and laughter, the reason why Graham stood so quietly at the edge of the ballroom. For all the luxury and surface shine of the Sutherland celebration, Graham knew what truly mattered. He knew that sometimes broken things are the ones most worth protecting, and that the people who have lost the most often love the hardest. As the memory of that little blue house faded into the past, Graham and Riley carried its lessons into every new beginning. They became experts at rebuilding, at starting over when the odds said stop. And even as Riley stepped into her new life, Graham felt the old promise burning in his chest to protect her dreams no matter how many times the world tried to break them. That resilience, the courage to keep moving, to trust in the power of new beginnings, was what would guide Graham as he faced his next challenge. For just as broken dreams can open the door to unexpected strength, survival often means learning how to build from the ground up. And so their story moved forward, away from loss and into the uncertain territory of starting over, where every small victory mattered and every setback was a lesson in disguise. Survival doesn't usually look like the movies. There are no stirring speeches or dramatic rescue scenes, just a slow, determined gathering of will morning after morning, bill after bill. When Graham and Riley Wells found themselves alone in the world, there was no map for what came next. There was only the daily task of making it through, keeping the lights on, finding enough to eat, and holding each other upright when grief tried to drag them under. For a while, survival felt like balancing on the thin edge of exhaustion, never certain which day would finally push them over. The duplex they rented was nothing like their childhood home. It was drafty in the winter and stuffy in the summer, with squeaky floors and neighbors whose lives spilled through thin walls. But Graham made it their own patching holes, with leftover paint fixing leaky faucets with borrowed tools and tacking up old photos of happier days. He learned quickly that comfort isn't about square footage or shiny appliances. It's about the sense of safety you create for the people you love. Riley, ever the optimist, found ways to make their space beautiful: thrift store curtains, paper flowers in mason jars, and tiny white lights strung along the kitchen window. Even on nights when dinner was just boxed macaroni or canned soup, they lit a candle and tried to remember that hope lives in small rituals. Money was a constant worry. Graham juggled 3 part-time jobs, never sure which would last another month. He poured coffee at the diner before sunrise, stacked shelves at the grocery store after dark, and spent weekends tutoring algebra at the community center. On days when all 3 overlapped, he'd grab an hour of sleep on the battered futon and wake to the sound of Riley making instant oatmeal. There were moments of bitter frustration: a car that broke down before payday, an unexpected medical bill, the sting of being unable to buy even the smallest treat. But they learned resourcefulness too: how to hunt for coupons, how to fix what broke, and how to ask for leftovers at the end of a restaurant shift. It wasn't always graceful. There were tears and slammed doors, worries spoken in whispers so the other wouldn't worry more. Riley sometimes wondered if she was holding Graham back, her college dreams a burden he carried alone. Graham, for his part, struggled with the invisible weight of expectation, feeling like he was never quite enough, that every failure was another sign he'd let their father down. These feelings didn't vanish overnight, but through each setback, they found ways to move forward together. They made lists, set tiny goals: pay off this month's rent, save up for a used laptop, find time for Riley to attend a campus tour. Every little victory became a celebration, a successful repair, a good grade, a rare afternoon off. In survival mode, you learn to take nothing for granted. The world outside sometimes seemed indifferent, even hostile. Graham watched as old friends on social media posted about internships, vacations, and new apartments, their lives untouched by sudden catastrophe. There was a sting in that comparison, a sense of falling behind, while everyone else sprinted ahead. He realized, though, that every life carried its own struggles, most just better hidden. Over time, he learned to let go of envy and measure his progress by a different yardstick, not by what he lacked, but by what he managed to hold together. There were small mercies along the way. A manager at the diner let Graham take home unsold pastries, saving them from the trash. A neighbor offered to drive Riley to school during a snowstorm. Even strangers like the clerk at the thrift store, who quietly rounded down the price when Graham didn't have enough, became threads in their safety net. These small acts of kindness reminded Graham that survival isn't always a solo act. Sometimes accepting help is its own kind of courage. The Wells siblings also discovered unexpected sources of joy. On Saturdays, if Graham could spare a few hours, they'd visit the city library, losing themselves in books and quiet corners. Sometimes they'd splurge on a used board game from a yard sale, laughing over missing pieces and made-up rules. These moments, silly, unplanned, full of laughter, became their antidote to worry. They learned that resilience is not just about gritting your teeth through hardship, but about carving out spaces where you can breathe. Remember who you are and imagine a future brighter than your present. One particular winter stands out in Graham's memory. Work was slow and money was tighter than ever. The heat in their apartment barely worked, and Riley came down with the flu just before finals. Graham remembers holding her hand as she shivered beneath a mountain of blankets, promising her that spring would come. He juggled shifts and picked up extra hours wherever he could, walking to work through icy streets, when the car finally gave out for good. Riley recovered, she always did, but the lesson stuck in survival mode. You have to believe stubbornly in a better day ahead. And sometimes the only way to keep going is to keep believing for someone else. If you ask Graham now what kept them afloat, he'll tell you it was faith not in miracles, but in the power of small, persistent effort. Every time he made dinner, every late-night conversation over lukewarm tea, every joke shared after a long shift was a stitch in the fabric of their survival. There were no shortcuts, no windfalls, no sudden rescues, just the slow, steady rebuilding of trust, safety, and hope, one day at a time. Perhaps the greatest gift of this period was perspective. Graham saw up close the quiet heroism that lives in ordinary people, single mothers counting pennies at the grocery store, bus drivers who know every rider by name, janitors who leave a space cleaner than they found it. He came to understand that success is not always measured by job titles or bank balances, but by the integrity with which you show up for the people who need you. A small example comes to mind: the Christmas when Graham and Riley had nothing to spare for gifts. Instead, they wrote letters to each other, pages filled with memories, apologies, and gratitude. Riley's letter, which Graham keeps in his wallet to this day, ended with a simple line: "Thank you for being my safe place in a world that isn't always kind." For Graham, that was worth more than anything he could have bought. The lesson, simple as it is, has guided him ever since when survival feels overwhelming. Focus on what you can control: your effort, your kindness, your willingness to try again. And remember, even when you're scraping by, you're still building something meaningful, brick by brick. As the years passed, the urgent panic of survival slowly gave way to something sturdier, a foundation built on perseverance and love. Riley graduated high school with honors, earning a partial scholarship to the state college. Graham, proud and relieved, took on a steadier job with better hours, finally able to sleep through the night without listening for the furnace to rattle. They were still far from wealthy, but they were no longer on the edge. Together, they had weathered the worst, and in doing so, discovered reserves of strength neither knew they possessed. Survival mode was never meant to last forever, but in learning how to endure, Graham and Riley unlocked the tools to build a life one small victory at a time. Their hardships became the bedrock for the next phase of their journey, a chapter not just about holding on, but about reaching for something more. Because after you learn to survive, you begin to wonder, could you possibly thrive? Sacrifice is a quiet language spoken in actions instead of words. No one pins a medal on your chest for the opportunities you give up or the dreams you tuck away in a drawer for someone else's sake. If survival mode was about doing what had to be done, the years that followed were about learning which parts of yourself you could set aside and which you couldn't bear to lose. For Graham Wells, those lessons took root slowly beneath the surface, shaping him in ways even he didn't always see. Graham never told Riley the full story of the scholarship he turned down. During his first semester of college, before everything fell apart, he'd been offered a spot in a competitive research program at a university out of state, a stepping stone to bigger things, the kind of opportunity bright students dream about. He remembers the way the letter felt in his hands, the weight of hope and pride. But after their father's accident with no one else to care for Riley, and the bills piling up, Graham never sent in his acceptance. He simply folded the letters, placed it in a shoebox beneath his bed, and never spoke of it again. That single choice rippled outwards, changing the shape of his entire life. It wasn't just a school or a diploma he let go of. It was the idea that his future could unfold freely without reference to anyone else's needs. Instead, he measured his success by quieter milestones, keeping Riley in school, getting the car fixed in time for her to take her driver's test, making rent, even when every paycheck was already spent in his mind. While friends on social media posted photos from campus parties or European backpacking trips, Graham learned to find joy in smaller victories: a hot dinner, a laugh shared over a late-night sitcom, Riley's face lighting up when she aced another test. There were costs Riley paid too, though she tried hard never to show it. She'd always been artistic, forever sketching scenes in the margins of her notebooks, or staying up late with watercolors spread across the kitchen table. Her dream was art school, but she knew the price tag was out of reach. So she adjusted her dream, settling for in-state tuition and a major in education, something practical, something safe. She took pride in her student teaching, in the ways she could brighten a child's day or turn a dull lesson into a game. Still, when she packed away her art supplies for the semester, there was always a small ache, a what if, that wouldn't quite let go. Not every sacrifice felt noble. There were moments of sharp regret, Graham watching his friends get engaged or take jobs in distant cities, Riley seeing classmates move into their own apartments. While she still shared a bathroom with her brother, they both learned to disguise their disappointments, to trade honesty for optimism. At family gatherings, when distant relatives asked about college or career plans, Riley would smile and mention her scholarship, never the nights spent working late at the grocery store. Graham would talk about his steady job and omit the side gigs that kept them afloat. If you asked them, they'd say things were fine, even on days when fine felt like a far-off shore. But sometimes the greatest strength is found in what you're willing to let go. Graham saw it in Riley's patience with children who struggled to read, her willingness to give up weekends for extra credit tutoring, her uncomplaining presence at his side when he needed her most. Riley, for her part, saw it in Graham's steadiness, how he could laugh at broken appliances, listen to her worries without judgment, and make a single chicken stretch for 3 days' worth of meals. These invisible sacrifices, made in 100 unglamorous ways, became the foundation of their relationship. There were cracks too, days when the stress spilled over. One autumn, Graham began dating a kind, thoughtful woman named Jenna. She understood his commitments, or tried to, but the demands of his life eventually wore them down. Graham would promise dinner, then cancel to cover a shift. Weekends away always lost out to Riley's school events or unexpected car trouble. Jenna wanted a partner who could dream bigger than just making it through the month. Eventually, she broke things off, not in anger, but with a quiet sadness. Graham let her go, wishing things could be different, but knowing he couldn't ask the world to wait for him. If there's a lesson in these invisible sacrifices, it's that love, real lasting love, rarely looks like the movies. It's not grand gestures or perfect timing. It's late-night grocery runs, shared chores, listening more than you speak. It's the willingness to put another person's needs above your own, even when it means standing in the background of your own life. Graham learned that the world is full of people who shout their accomplishments from the rooftops. But sometimes the truest measure of worth is found in the things you do when no one is watching. There are countless families who live this reality every day. Siblings who skip their own school dances to babysit parents who work 3 jobs and still show up for the game, spouses who move cities or switch careers so their partner can chase a dream. In America, the myth of the self-made success runs deep, but the truth is, almost every story of triumph is rooted in the unseen efforts of someone else. Graham often wondered how many people went unthanked, how many victories quietly belonged to more than one name. Looking back, he wouldn't have traded places with anyone. The sacrifices he and Riley made didn't just keep them afloat, they knit them together in ways no hardship could break. Every deferred dream, every compromise became another stitch in the fabric of a life they built together. And while he sometimes wondered what might have been if things had gone differently, he always came back to a simple truth: he was exactly where he was meant to be doing, what needed to be done for the person who mattered most. It's a lesson Graham would need to remember as new opportunities and new pressures began to appear on the horizon, because after years of standing in the background, quietly giving up what he wanted, a question began to form. Was it finally time to reach for something more? Could he honor his commitments and still allow himself to dream again? As Riley's college graduation approached and Graham's steady job hinted at a promotion, the world felt just a little wider, the possibilities just a bit closer. The invisible sacrifices that had defined their lives had prepared them for something new. A chance, however uncertain, to step out of survival mode and build a future that belonged to both of them. There's a special kind of courage that grows out of having nothing left to lose. For Graham Wells, that courage didn't come all at once. It crept in, quietly filling the space where old routines once lived, urging him to imagine something more for himself and for Riley. He didn't wake up one morning with a sudden calling. There was no flash of inspiration, no angel investor knocking on the door. Instead, it was the slow accumulation of small frustrations and modest triumphs, the daily realization that survival was no longer enough. As Riley approached college graduation, their lives felt steady for the first time in years. But beneath the relief, Graham sensed a new restlessness. Was this all he could hope for, a safe, small life, built out of other people's leftovers? Or could he risk building something that was truly his? It was during a late shift at the diner, while tallying receipts with tired hands, that Graham first reconnected with Eddie Tran, a friend from his community college days. Eddie had always been a restless spirit, full of wild ideas and untested theories, bouncing from job to job with a kind of hopeful audacity Graham secretly admired. Over greasy coffee and half-eaten pie, Eddie shared his latest vision, a tech startup focused on automating warehouse operations for small businesses, an idea born out of watching his own family's import stores struggle with inventory chaos during the pandemic. Everyone's talking about billion-dollar apps for Silicon Valley giants, Eddie said. But what about the businesses down the street? My mom's store, your old boss at the grocer? We could actually help real people. At first, Graham laughed it off. He wasn't a coder. He didn't have a trust fund or a Stanford diploma, but Eddie had done his homework and his pitch was both simple and compelling. He needed someone practical, someone who understood how to organize chaos and talk to customers. You survived more curveballs than anyone I know, Graham, Eddie grinned. That's the only skill that really matters. For weeks, Graham wrestled with the idea, listing every reason to say no: too risky, too late, too much to lose if it failed. But he couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, this was the chance to build a future on his own terms. They started small, so small it was almost laughable. Eddie's bedroom became their headquarters. They borrowed an old laptop from Riley and scavenged secondhand parts from Craigslist. Graham learned about logistics software from YouTube tutorials, scribbling notes late into the night. Their first clients were local businesses, willing to give them a shot in exchange for deep discounts, or more often just pizza and goodwill. The first time their program actually worked, automatically tracking inventory and reordering supplies for a neighborhood bakery, Graham felt a rush of satisfaction that rivaled any paycheck he'd ever brought home. But for every tiny win, there were setbacks that nearly crushed them. Software bugs that made orders disappear, late-night calls from panicked clients. One particularly disastrous month, an update went wrong and froze an entire store's inventory system on the day before a major holiday. Graham and Eddie drove across town in a borrowed car at midnight, eating vending machine snacks while fixing the mess by hand. This is what they never show you in those tech founder documentaries, Graham joked, exhausted and greasy. Still, every crisis taught them something new. They learned to apologize sincerely, to work until the job was done, and maybe, most importantly, to laugh at their own failures before anyone else could. There were moments when quitting seemed like the only reasonable option. The bills kept coming, sometimes faster than the clients. Riley, ever supportive, took on more hours at her teaching job and painted watercolor greeting cards to sell at local craft fairs. "You're not alone in this," she reminded Graham more than once. "We've come too far to give up now." Those words mattered more than she knew. Each time the doubt threatened to overwhelm him, Graham remembered what survival had taught him. Persistence beats talent, and resilience is the real superpower. Eventually, small businesses began to notice their work. Word spread through neighborhood associations, then local business networks, and soon Graham found himself fielding calls from people he'd never met. The startup didn't make him rich, not yet anyway, but it offered something even more precious: hope and a growing sense of pride. For the first time since their father's accident, Graham allowed himself to imagine a life that wasn't built solely on sacrifice. He pictured Riley in her own classroom himself, running a team, maybe even having weekends off to rest or travel. The horizon, once so narrow, now shimmered with possibility. Along the way, Graham learned lessons no textbook could teach. He discovered that most success stories are built on a mountain of small failures, patched together by stubborn people who refuse to stay down. He saw firsthand how lonely entrepreneurship can feel, how easy it is to envy others who seem to be racing ahead, unaware that everyone carries their own burdens behind the scenes. He came to respect the people who keep trying year after year, not because they are fearless, but because their dreams are stronger than their doubts. One night, as they celebrated signing their 20th client, Eddie raised a plastic cup in a mock toast. To starting from nothing, he said, and to never forgetting why we started in the first place. Graham grinned, thinking of Riley's smile, the old house they'd lost, and the winding path that had brought him here. To family, he replied, and to building something worth passing on. If there's a lesson at the heart of Graham's journey, it's this: greatness isn't reserved for the privileged or the bold. Sometimes it belongs to the ones who keep showing up, fixing what breaks, and refusing to let go of the belief that tomorrow can be better. The startup was never just about making money. It was about reclaiming agency, about proving to himself that his story wasn't finished yet. And that, in the end, was a dream big enough for both him and Riley. As the business grew, so did Graham's sense of possibility. He started to see himself not just as a survivor or caretaker, but as a builder of products, of relationships, of a life worth living. He took more risks, trusted his instincts, and began to hope out loud instead of just in secret. There were still plenty of unknowns, and failure was always a possibility. But as Graham looked around at the tiny office cluttered with coffee cups and late-night ideas, he knew they had already built something remarkable, a second chance, forged out of grit and love from rock bottom all the way up. The horizon kept shifting, and with each new challenge, Graham felt more ready to meet it head on. For the first time, he didn't just want to survive, he wanted to thrive. And as Riley flourished in her new life and his business slowly took root, Graham sensed that the sacrifices of yesterday had become the stepping stones of today's hope. For Graham Wells' ambition was never a solo journey. Every new milestone with the startup, every fresh opportunity, was measured against one constant question: how does this help Riley? The habit ran deep, built from years when their bond was the only safety net they had. Even as the business grew and Riley flourished as a new teacher, Graham felt the old instincts rise, checking in before every big decision, saving for her rainy days before he dreamed of his own. Some people call it selflessness. For Graham, it was simply family. There's a peculiar tension in chasing big dreams while holding tight to the ones you love. As Riley's first year in her own classroom began, the startup's client list doubled, and Eddie pressed for expansion. He saw new markets, new hires, and maybe even a tiny office they wouldn't have to share with a cat named Mr. Tux. But for Graham, growth meant risk, longer hours, more travel, less certainty. He worried about leaving Riley alone in their small apartment, about missing her school events, about being too distracted when she needed to talk. So he set boundaries: no work calls during family dinners, no travel on her birthday, always a Saturday afternoon for just the two of them, even if it was just grocery shopping and shared ice cream on the porch. It wasn't a perfect system. More than once, Graham missed an important call to make sure Riley had a ride home from work. He lost a potential investor after showing up late, having detoured to fix a flat tire on Riley's car. Sometimes he wondered if he was holding himself or the business back by putting family first. It's a question that plagues many who grow up as caretakers. When is it okay to put your needs first? Where's the line between loyalty and limitation? What surprised Graham most was how often the answer turned out to be both and. He watched as Riley, newly independent, stretched her own wings. She didn't want her brother sacrificing everything for her anymore. Instead, she started showing up for him, bringing lunch to his office, offering ideas for the business's website, and once helping clean after a water leak ruined their workspace. She took pride in being his partner, not just his little sister. "We can both win," she'd remind him every time he hesitated. "Let's try." Family first didn't mean shrinking dreams. It meant building a longer table, inviting each other to the feast. Graham learned to ask for help, not just from Riley, but from friends' clients, and even Eddie's big, boisterous family. They hosted cookouts for their startup team, celebrated wins together, and offered rides or childcare when needed. The business became a little community held together, not just by profit, but by genuine care. It was messy, full of overlap between work and life, but it felt right. They were building something that lasted beyond the next contract or quarterly review. One autumn, Riley faced a setback. A budget cut at her school eliminated the after-school art program she'd poured her heart into. Graham watched her fight for her students, writing grants, fundraising, even organizing a community mural on weekends. When the school board finally relented, it wasn't just Riley who celebrated. Graham and Eddie were there, paint-splattered and tired, knowing that her victory was theirs too. In those moments, Graham realized how often American families are forced to choose between supporting each other and chasing individual goals. But he also saw how, when you refuse to let go, you create a strength that outlasts any single success or failure. It wasn't always easy. There were late nights of doubt and tension arguments over money-missed birthdays, moments when old fears surfaced. Graham sometimes envied his peers who had nothing holding them back, no siblings to worry over, no past full of unpaid bills. But every time he considered pulling away, he remembered what it felt like to have nothing but each other. He would choose Riley every time, even if it slowed his journey. The lesson was simple, but profound. Ambition is only as meaningful as the people you share it with. When you build a life that honors both dreams and devotion, you find a balance that can withstand almost anything. Graham learned to stop apologizing for putting family first, and instead wore it as a badge of pride. In a world that often praises individual achievement above all, he found joy in shared triumphs in the way Riley cheered his business wins, and he hers. Together they proved that loyalty isn't a weakness, it's a foundation. They built new traditions as adults: Sunday dinners, joint holiday parties, annual goal-setting brunches where they mapped out dreams big and small. Riley helped Graham see that his worth wasn't measured by relentless hustle or endless sacrifice, but by the love he brought into every room. Graham in turn reminded Riley that it was okay to take risks, to fail, and to try again. They carried each other's hopes as if they were their own, learning that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask your family to walk with you rather than for you. Slowly, the tightness of old survival habits eased. Graham trusted Riley to make her own way, to build her own career and friendships, even as he pushed his business forward. He gave himself permission to rest, to date again, to say yes to things that scared him, knowing he had someone in his corner always. And as their world expanded, so did their confidence. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were beginning to thrive. One evening, as they sat on the fire escape of their building, sharing takeout and laughter, Riley looked out at the city lights and said, "You know, I think we're really going to be okay." For Graham, it was the greatest reward he could imagine, not a startup IPO or magazine feature, but the quiet certainty that their bond had carried them this far and would keep them safe as the future unfolded. The journey wasn't finished, of course. New challenges waited, some as thrilling as a business breakthrough, others as heartbreaking as a family health scare or a friendship lost to distance. But the lesson they carried forward was clear. When you make room for each other, you make room for growth too. As Graham prepared to take the next big leap with his startup, and Riley planned her first summer camp for kids who'd never had an art class, they felt ready. Not because life was suddenly easy, or because they'd figured out all the answers, but because together they'd built a life where every ambition was rooted in love and every risk was met with open arms. The world Riley stepped into with Mason Sutherland was dazzlingly different from anything she or Graham had known. The first time Mason invited her to a family dinner, Riley called Graham, in a panic, unsure what to wear, worried about which fork to use, afraid her public school stories would sound small, against a backdrop of private tutors and ski vacations. Graham tried to reassure her, half joking, that if she got desperate, she could always steer the conversation to football scores. But beneath his laughter was a quiet unease. What would it mean for Riley, and for their bond if she became part of a world that had always looked right past people like them. The Sutherland home perched on a hill above the city was all high ceilings and hushed luxury. Riley described it later as walking into a magazine, art everywhere, a grand piano no one played, and a dining room lit by a chandelier that probably cost more than Graham's car. The Sutherlands were polite enough, but Graham noticed the small things when he met them for the first time. Grant Sutherland Mason's father shook Graham's hand with the practiced indifference of a man who measured people by their resume. He nodded at Graham's business, but made it clear without ever saying so that the real power in the room rested with those who owned not just companies, but legacies. Graham had faced condescension before, but rarely so well dressed. Grant's questions were thinly veiled interviews. Where did you go to school? Who do you know in the city? Do you have any family in finance? Graham answered honestly, watching Grant's interest flicker and fade at each humble reply. The Sutherland's friends made similar rounds curious, but always circling back to their own inside jokes and country club plans. Graham found himself stuck at the edges of conversation, his jokes landing flat, his accomplishments dismissed as nice for a small business. For Riley, the contrast was starker. Mason's mother asked about her teaching with mild approval, but quickly shifted the conversation to charity galas and alumni dinners. Riley, usually bright and quick, felt herself shrinking, worrying her thrift store dress looked out of place. Afterward, she told Graham, I felt like a guest at someone else's holiday welcome, but not quite home. Graham hugged her tightly, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Still, Mason was different. He adored Riley, saw her strengths, and seemed immune to the invisible rules of his upbringing. When his family questioned Riley's background, he shut it down gently, but firmly. He visited her school, marveled at her mural projects, and learned the names of her favorite students. For Graham, watching Mason support Riley became a test of his own preconceptions. Not everyone from privilege was dismissive or blind to the struggles of others. Sometimes love bridged even the widest divides. Yet the challenge for Graham was deeper than manners or money. He saw how easy it was in gatherings of power and tradition for people like Riley and himself to doubt their worth. He remembered countless moments from his own life. The first time a professor assumed he was a janitor, not a student. The way his childhood neighbors clammed up when talk turned to savings and investments. The unspoken message was always the same: you're welcome to visit, but don't get too comfortable. What Graham came to understand, though, was that dignity had nothing to do with wallpaper or wine lists. It was about refusing to measure your value by someone else's standards. Over time, he learned to hold his ground at Sutherland gatherings, to speak with quiet confidence about his business, to laugh off awkward silences, and to celebrate the things that made his family unique. He realized that his story and Riley's were not liabilities to be hidden, but strengths to be honored. There were moments of grace, too. One chilly December, the Sutherlands hosted a fundraiser for a local children's hospital. Riley volunteered to run the art table, turning bored, overdressed kids into creative whirlwinds. Graham helped string lights in the garden, chatting with the catering staff and teaching a few board members how to actually hang a garland without it falling. Mason watched it all, pride shining in his eyes. For that evening, the lines blurred. Graham, Riley, and Mason worked side by side, the old and new worlds, stitched together by laughter and shared purpose. Of course, the contrast didn't vanish. Graham saw how much easier life was when you started with connections and capital, how mistakes were quietly fixed, and opportunities multiplied. He noticed how, after the party, Grant Sutherland thanked him for his help with the logistics, but never once asked about his plans or ideas. But this time, Graham didn't let it sting. He knew who he was, and he knew that his value wasn't up for negotiation. One lesson stayed with him: never let someone else's comfort zone define your boundaries. Graham saw too many people, from high school to business networking events, shrink to fit the rooms they entered, trading authenticity for acceptance. He promised himself and Riley that they would not do the same. They would bring their whole selves, stories, and all to every table. The reality is that class in America is often invisible, woven into accent, opportunity, and assumption. But family loyalty, hard-earned pride, and the courage to show up as yourself, those things are visible to anyone willing to really look. Graham found allies in unexpected places: a Sutherland cousin who envied Riley's sense of purpose, a housekeeper who shared recipes and life advice, a city councilwoman who remembered growing up just as poor. Over time, the circle widened, and the invisible became a little less lonely. As Riley and Mason's relationship grew, so did the pressure. Invitations piled up, expectations mounted, and soon there were whispers about wedding dates and future children. Graham watched his sister navigate the Sutherland world with humor and humility. She stood a little taller each time, learning to claim her space without apology. And Graham, once so anxious about losing her to another family, realized instead that their bond was only growing stronger. Tested, yes, but never broken. For every moment of discomfort, there was a new story to add to their collection. The night they played charades in formal wear, the time Graham outgrilled Grant at a 4th of July barbecue, the morning Riley led a volunteer cleanup crew, and half the Sutherland guests joined her muddy shoes and all. These were the moments that stitched their lives together, proving that new chapters don't mean erasing the old ones, they just add depth to the story. The final lesson was simple but vital in any room. Your worth is not set by the opinions of those with more power or pedigree. It is set by your history, your choices, and the love you carry for those who came before you. Graham learned to move through the Sutherland world with gentle defiance, grateful for new opportunities, but never ashamed of where he started. And in watching Riley thrive, he saw the clearest proof that authenticity was always the best answer to judgment. The stage was set for something bigger. As Mason prepared to propose and Graham's business entered talks with major new clients, some from the Sutherland circle, life was about to change again. For Graham and Riley, the challenge would be to keep their integrity and their bond strong, even as the world widened in unexpected and sometimes uncomfortable ways. On the day of Riley and Mason's wedding, the air at Sutherland Country Club hummed with anticipation. The lawns were a patchwork of pastels and silk, and the reception hall sparkled with enough gold trim to make anyone feel for a moment like a character in a fairy tale. For Riley, it was the culmination of years of hard-won joy, laughter, and lessons learned through struggle. For Graham, standing at the edge of it all the day felt both like a victory and a test. He watched Riley glide from table to table, radiant in her happiness, while the Sutherland family orchestrated every detail with seamless precision. He was proud of his sister, proud of how far they'd come together, but a familiar uncertainty lingered. Was there really space for their whole story here, or just the parts that fit into the Sutherland version of happily ever after? As dinner plates were cleared and the band prepared for the first dance, a ripple moved through the crowd, a small note passed to Graham by one of the catering staff. "You're up next for a speech," it read in careful handwriting. Graham blinked, heart pounding. He hadn't prepared anything. The program hadn't called for the brother of the bride, and for a brief, anxious moment, he wondered if this was some last-minute prank. But as the MC announced his name, all eyes turned toward him. In that hush, Graham realized he had a choice: shrink into the background or step forward and speak the truth of their journey. He walked to the microphone, voice steady but soft, pausing as a sea of unfamiliar faces turned to listen. "My name is Graham Wells," he began. "Most of you know me as Riley's brother. What you might not know is that for a long time, Riley and I were all the family we had." He let the words settle. After we lost our parents, it was just the two of us figuring out life as best we could. There were years when we didn't have much, but every small victory, every milestone we reached together, Riley is the reason I kept going, the reason I learned that love isn't measured by money or titles, but by who shows up for you when the world feels impossible. The room shifted, glasses lowering, faces softening. Graham's voice grew stronger. "I've seen Riley fight for her students, for her dreams, and for every child who ever needed a safe place to land. I've watched her bring light to rooms that didn't know they were dark. She's braver than anyone here will ever know." He glanced at Mason and smiled. "Mason, you're lucky to have her. We all are. But the best thing you can do is stand with her as she's always stood for others." He hesitated, considering the faces in front of him, the Sutherlands, their friends, his own small circle of supporters. This was the moment that could either close doors or open them. So he added quietly but firmly, "And I'd like to share one more thing. When you look at Riley or at me, you might see people who started with less. But the truth is, our story isn't about what we lost. It's about what we built. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones you overlook. Sometimes the greatest achievements aren't measured by resumes or stock portfolios, but by kindness, resilience, and the courage to keep going." The words unplanned and honest seemed to change the room. He saw Grant Sutherland's face shift curiosity, then something closer to respect. He saw Riley wipe a tear and Mason squeeze her hand. The applause when it came was gentle but real. People Graham had never spoken to approached him afterward, the Sutherland's neighbors, a teacher from Riley's school, even a distant cousin who quietly admitted that his own family's fortune had come after years of struggle. For the first time, Graham felt not just accepted but seen. The speech became a pivot point, not just for that evening but for how the two families would move forward together. Barriers softened, old assumptions crumbled, and new conversations began. In the hours that followed, Graham found himself at the center of the celebration rather than its edge. He danced with Riley, shared stories with Mason's uncles, and even caught Grant Sutherland nodding in approval as he led a group of children through a scavenger hunt in the garden. The lesson from that day was simple, but powerful stories, real, honest stories, change hearts. Too often, people make judgments from a distance, measuring worth with a checklist or a pedigree. But when you step up and tell the truth about what you've endured, what you've sacrificed, and what you hope for, you invite others to lay down their pretense and meet you as equals. Graham realized that the courage to speak openly, even when you fear rejection, is the very thing that draws people closer. He also saw how resilience is contagious. By owning his own journey, Graham gave others permission to do the same. The Sutherlands, so practiced in their hospitality, so cautious in their pride, let down their guard, if only for an evening. New friendships formed over shared memories of hardship and hope. The celebration, once separated into quiet corners, became a single joyful tapestry stitched together by laughter, music, and the gentle pride of two families finally learning each other's language. Of course, the afterglow didn't erase every difference. There were still challenges ahead, decisions about the business, about Riley and Mason's future, about what it meant to be part of a blended family with two very different pasts. But the wall between us and them felt thinner, more permeable. Graham had learned that sometimes all it takes to change a story is to tell it honestly and to trust that given the chance, most people will choose to listen. That night, long after the music faded and the last guests drifted home, Graham and Riley sat together on the steps outside, watching the stars emerge over the quiet grounds. I was afraid, Riley admitted, that our story would never fit in here, that we'd always have to leave part of ourselves at the door. Graham squeezed her hand, smiling softly. Not anymore, he said. We belong everywhere. Our story is welcome. It was a simple moment, but for Graham it was the beginning of something new. The freedom to claim his place, to stop shrinking from the spotlight, and to let his life, messy, imperfect, beautiful, be seen. Success, when it finally came to Graham and Eddie's startup, didn't arrive with confetti or applause. It came in the form of serious emails, suddenly important phone calls, and a new weight to every decision. A year after Riley's wedding, the company had built a loyal network of clients and caught the attention of bigger fish regional chains investors, and eventually even Grant Sutherland's business circle. What began as a desperate gamble with thrift store laptops and late-night ramen was now a sustainable operation. There were days Graham would catch himself walking the length of their tiny office, almost waiting for something to go wrong. So accustomed was he to fighting uphill battles. But now, the challenge wasn't mere survival. It was deciding what kind of future to build and what to refuse no matter the price. It was Grant himself who brokered the first big offer, an acquisition proposal that would have paid out more money than Graham and Eddie had ever dreamed. The plan was simple on paper. Sell the company, join Sutherland's tech division for a couple of years, and then enjoy the rewards. There were perks, golden handcuffs, and a string of incentives meant to sweeten the deal. For Eddie, it was a life-changing opportunity enough to pay off his family's debts, maybe help his parents retire early. For Graham, the temptation was real, especially with all the years of scraping by still echoing in his memory. The offer looked perfect from the outside, but something about it gnawed at Graham late into the night. He remembered the early days lugging laptops into bakeries, fixing bugs by flashlight writing code at the kitchen table, while Riley painted lesson plans beside him. He thought of their first clients, still calling for advice, still trusting Graham and Eddie with the daily realities of their dreams. Would Sutherland's tech division care as much about those little businesses? Or would they get lost in a sea of bigger priorities? What would happen to the startup spirit, the belief that real innovation was about helping ordinary people, not just scaling up and cashing out? The days that followed were tense. Eddie lobbied for the deal, hopeful but understanding. It's your call, man. You built this with me. Just, let's not be those guys who work themselves to the bone and never see a penny. Graham's accountant Riley and even some friends weighed in. Riley, as always, was honest. I want you to be comfortable. I want you to rest. But don't sell yourself short, Graham. Not if it means losing what matters most. Graham did what he'd always done when faced with a crossroads. He listened. Not just to the advice of others, but to his own heart and the quiet voice inside that knew the difference between a good deal and the right deal. He met with Grant in the glass-walled conference room overlooking the city. Grant spoke smoothly about opportunity and legacy, about how the Sutherland name opened doors that could change lives. Graham listened, asked questions, but didn't commit. He spent hours talking to Eddie, running the numbers, imagining what it would feel like to let go. He took long walks at night, thinking of his father's hands fixing leaky pipes, his mother's gentle encouragement, and the promises he'd made to himself and to Riley. He also spoke to his earliest clients, people who ran corner stores, mom-and-pop groceries, and family bakeries, about what they needed, what they feared. We trust you, one owner said, because you care about the little guy. Don't stop doing that. It was a reminder that sometimes the value you create in the world can't be measured by a payout, but by the ripple effect of keeping your word. Graham saw, too, the mistakes others had made, promising startups swallowed whole by bigger companies, their founders silenced or pushed out their products forgotten. He read stories of brands built on integrity that lost their soul in the rush to scale, and he saw examples fewer but brighter of those who held out, grew slowly, and stayed true to the people who believed in them first. Companies like MailChimp or Basecamp, who built on trust and independence, not just numbers. The lesson became clear. In a world that tells you to grab every dollar, dignity means knowing when to say no. It means remembering who you are and what you stand for when the stakes are highest. It means trusting that long-term respect, yours and others, is worth more than a quick windfall. When Graham finally gave his answer, it wasn't with bravado or bitterness. He thanked Grant, explained the values that shaped the company, and turned down the acquisition. We're not ready to sell, he said. Not if it means losing the mission or the personal touch our clients count on. Grant, surprised, but not offended, nodded. There was a glint of new respect in his eyes, a recognition that some things can't be bought even in business. Eddie, at first disappointed, later said, I'm proud of you. Let's prove we made the right call. Saying no was only the beginning. Graham and Eddie doubled down on what made their business different: personal service, honest pricing, and a community-minded approach. They expanded but carefully, taking on new clients who shared their values, partnering with nonprofits, and hiring people whose stories echoed their own. Riley helped them launch an internship program for local high schoolers, remembering how much it had meant to her to have someone believe in her when the odds seemed long. Of course, it wasn't always easy. There were months when money was tight, when doubts crept in, when another lucrative offer made them second-guess their decision. But every time Graham wavered, he remembered the speech he'd given at Riley's wedding, the lessons he'd learned from survival, and the promise he'd made to build something that mattered, not just something that made money. He learned to measure success not by profit alone, but by pride in a day's work and the loyalty of those who chose to stand by him. As word spread about the company's choice to remain independent, new opportunities followed. Clients and collaborators who valued integrity sought them out. They gained a reputation not just for good technology, but for good character. Graham found new confidence, trusting himself to make hard choices and to lead with heart, not just calculation. The lesson for Graham, and for anyone balancing ambition with authenticity, was simple. Sometimes the greatest legacy is not what you sell, but what you refuse to give up. Independence is hard-won, easily lost, and always worth protecting. Graham understood that every no to a shortcut or an easy out was really a yes to something deeper: faith in himself, in Riley, in their journey. As the business entered its next chapter and Riley began talking about starting her own family, Graham felt the pull of the past easing. They had built a life that honored both their roots and their dreams, a life that proved you could thrive without forgetting where you started. There were new questions ahead, new risks to take, and always new lessons waiting around the corner. But Graham knew now, with the certainty that only comes from experience, that dignity is never for sale, and that every true success is built on the courage to choose your own path, no matter how tempting the alternative. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges of memory. As years passed, Graham and Riley found themselves settling into lives that once seemed impossibly out of reach. Lives built not on sudden fortune, but on the steady work of loving, choosing, and rebuilding again and again. There were no magazine covers or viral stories to mark their triumphs. Instead, their victories showed up quietly in the hum of a thriving business, in the laughter echoing through Riley's sun-filled apartment, in Sunday dinners with friends and neighbors who had become family. Graham's company, once just a risky idea hatched over late-night coffee, became a cornerstone for other small businesses, helping neighborhood shops survive lean seasons, mentoring young people, and quietly supporting local causes. He measured his success not in the size of his bank account, but in the number of people who called him reliable, honest, or simply friend. His days were full, but no longer frantic. His choices guided by the values he and Riley had fought to protect. Occasionally, he received new offers to sell or merge, but now he answered with confidence, secure in the knowledge that his worth and his company's did not depend on outside approval. For Riley, teaching became more than a job. It was a calling. She brought art and hope into classrooms where students sometimes had little else. Her annual mural projects became a cherished tradition, and her former students often returned years later, eager to show her the portfolios or college acceptance letters she'd inspired. Riley eventually built her own small art camp for children who couldn't afford lessons elsewhere, using what she had learned about resilience to encourage them to trust their imaginations and their voices. Her kindness rippled outward, creating echoes of courage and creativity that would last far beyond her own reach. Both Graham and Riley grew into roles neither had planned, and in doing so discovered that legacy isn't always loud. Sometimes the most powerful influence comes from showing up year after year in the lives of others listening, forgiving and leading, not by orders, but by example. Friends would ask Graham how he found the strength to keep going during hard times. He'd shrug and smile. "You don't really know how strong you are," he'd say, "until life gives you no other choice." But when you hold on to what matters, you find you can do more than you ever imagined. There were, of course, new challenges. Riley faced the heartbreak of losing a beloved principal who'd mentored her. Graham struggled to adapt as technology changed and the business world shifted. They both watched friends drift away or move across the country. But their foundation held not because it was perfect, but because it was real, layered with forgiveness, patience, and a deep, unspoken understanding. On quiet nights sharing takeout and stories of the day, they still reminded each other, "Look how far we've come." One spring, Riley welcomed her first child, a little girl named Elise. Graham became an uncle, and holding his niece, for the first time he was struck by the quiet cycle of legacy, each generation building on the love, sacrifice, and hope of those who came before. He saw in Riley's gentle teaching and Elise's bright curiosity the same spirit that had carried their family through darkness into light. It was a humbling reminder that the most important gifts are rarely material. Instead, they live on in memories, values, and the quiet confidence passed down from hand to hand. If there's one lesson Graham and Riley's journey offers, it's this. You don't have to be extraordinary to make a difference. Sometimes all it takes is the willingness to care, to work hard, and to stand by your people, even when no one is watching. The world often celebrates the boldest voices, the flashiest achievements. But the roots of any real community are found in the small, steadfast acts of ordinary love meals, shared debts, forgiven mistakes, mended, and dreams nurtured with patient hope. Graham found himself reflecting often on what it meant to truly win in life. Was it wealth, recognition, or a legacy others envied? Or was it something quieter, a reputation for kindness, a home where laughter could always be found, a business that made space for others to grow? For him, the answer was simple. Every day he chose to act with integrity to uplift Riley and those around him. He felt a sense of peace that no windfall could buy. As the years unfurled, Graham and Riley stayed close, sometimes in the same city, sometimes separated by miles, but never by heart. Their phone calls remained frequent, their inside jokes as sharp as ever. Each birthday, each milestone became another page in the story they'd written together, one of courage, quiet strength, and the unbreakable bond of chosen family. Their story isn't unique, and that's what makes it powerful. Across the country, in small towns and busy cities, millions of people are quietly building legacies, just like Graham and Riley's, rooted in sacrifice, love, and the hope that tomorrow can be better. Their lives are rarely broadcast, but their impact is everywhere. If you've ever shown up for someone, put family first, or dared to build a dream on a shoestring, You are part of this legacy too. As Graham looked back on all that had happened, he understood that every invisible act of resilience, every sacrifice, and every moment of hope had shaped not only his future, but the future of everyone who followed. And as Riley's daughter learned to walk and Graham's company hired its first intern from their neighborhood, the cycle began again, ordinary people quietly becoming heroes for each other one day at a time. So, as this story closes, let it remind you, you don't have to wait for the world to notice before you make your life count. The real measure of legacy is in the lives you touch, the dreams you inspire, and the love you give without asking for anything in return. May we all be a little more like Graham and Riley, steady, hopeful, and quietly strong, knowing that sometimes the most extraordinary victories are the ones no one else sees. Thank you for joining this journey. If Graham and Riley's story moved, you share your own stories of quiet strength and resilience below. Like, subscribe, and let's build a community where every ordinary hero has a place to be seen.